There you go.
Thank you. Welcome back to Senate Education. We are now looking at the side-by-side on the miscellaneous education bill. Senators will recall, I believe it was Senator Hewitt who made the good recommendation of, let's take a look at side-by-side. It's in your packet. It's like this. For home study programs. What's happening now? What's going forward? And I think that was largely the task. St. James, am I remembering this correctly?
The direction I received was to a side-by-side of H 161 section 5 versus current law. I'm sorry, 461, which is the
It's good.
miscellaneous
Yep.
ed, section 5, which is the amendments to the home study program.
Great.
In contrast with current law.
That's it. So if you wouldn't mind.
Sure, Beth St. James, Office of Legislative Counsel. So I think is this the first side-by-side you worked with this session? Oh no, I did one in school safety.
You did one school safety.
Okay. So usually we prepare side-by-sides. We're looking at like a House version and a Senate version. And so, or current law or in changes to current law. So this is pretty illustrative. And this is just changes to one section in Title 16, which is 166B, the home study program. So the left-hand column is current law, and the right-hand column is the proposed changes under H 461, Section 5, as passed by the House. So I know the agency had some testimony for some very small changes to the language in Section 5, and they are not incorporated in here. But for, I think, your purposes today, I don't think it'll make much of a difference.
And if anybody sees any concerns they have, now would be the time to either add or subtract. Yeah, Senator Hewitt.
Was it always called the home study program? Or was that a name that changed?
In this bill, in H 461?
No,
In history.
Oh, I don't know the history off the top of my head.
I always think of the French school
I don't
program.
know, yeah. You don't have to look it up.
This-
That's fine.
The statute is currently entitled Home Study Program, and its last amendment was, well, in 2019, but I don't think that, but I'll make a note of that to look and see if that's what's always been.
I'm just curious, because I don't think there's any kind of a mandate to actually study. So that's just an observation.
I will look into the history on that. I tried my best to pair up, you'll see there's like lots of weird spacing, and that's so that similar provisions are on the same line as each other, hopefully. And then in separate sections, I'll point them out to you. You'll see things are a little out of order so that they match up for comparison's sake. But so they both versions begin with an enrollment notice in subsection A. And you'll see on the right-hand column, this is all, everything that's yellow are the proposed amendments or additions to current law. And so you'll see it starts by just striking all of the current language prior to March 1st. So March 1st to all the way up to enrollment notice is just struck, and then there's new language added. So a parent or legal guardian sends annual notice of intent to enroll the parent or legal guardian's child in a home study program at least 10 business days prior to commencing home study. That's what's being proposed. Current law is contains a little bit more specific language about re-enrolling and new notice, et cetera. And that provision on what happens for re-enrollment and new notices, you'll find that in the further in the amendments. But the information that's contained in the enrollment notice, subdivision 1, there's an addition of the term of the date. Current law only requires the month and year of birth, and then there's an amendment requiring the date of birth. Subdivision 2, adding email addresses for the guardians. And some clarifying language there. So it's all parents or guardians with legal custody who are legally authorized to make educational decisions for the student. And then Subdivision 3, this is, subdivision 3 just required as part of the enrollment notice, an assessment of progress required under subsection D, which occurs later in the current law. What the amendment does on the right-hand side is it actually takes all of the assessment language and puts it up into the enrollment notice section. So the amendment H461 proposes to require that the enrollment notice contains an attestation that the academic progress of each child enrolled in a home study program will be assessed at the end of each school year, and then that the parent or guardian will maintain the record of such assessments, and that it spells out permitted means of assessments. I have taken that language and put it further down so you can see it side by side by what's required in current law for assessments. But so in current law, the enrollment notice has to, is kind of referring to what those assessments are, and then the amendment is pulling that information up into the enrollment notice section. And there are some changes to it, but I think it's easier to look at when you see it side by side. Subdivision 4 on page 2. This is about children with a disability. So current law, you'll see on the left-hand side. The amendment proposes striking the requirement that there's a comprehensive, requires a reference to the ordering by a hearing officer of a comprehensive evaluation. That language is struck. And what's required now in the annual notice would be whether the child has a documented disability and how the disability may affect the student's educational progress in a home study program. Division 5. Current law requires a detailed outline or narrative that describes the content to be provided in each subject area of the minimum course of study, including any special services or adaptations to be made to accommodate any disability. The amendment to H461 removes that requirement. So no longer would a detailed outline or narrative of the content to be provided in each subject area be required. What would be required on that right-hand side in yellow is an attestation that each child being enrolled in a home study will be provided the equivalent of at least 175 days of instruction in the minimum course of study, specifically for a child who is younger than 13 years of age. The subject area is listed in section 906 of this title, which is the minimum course of study statute. And then for a child who is 13, those specific courses. And for students with documented disabilities, a parent or guardian must attest to providing adaptations to support the student in the home study program. So that language about the minimum course of study actually appears in current law in a different section, and I put that language side by side so you can see it. But the big piece here is current law requires that detailed outline or narrative of the content, and the amendment removes that requirement. We move on to subdivision 6. H461 proposes to just repeal this information, the requirement of this information altogether. So the names, addresses, telephone numbers, and signatures of the people who will be providing ongoing instruction in each subject area of the minimum course of study. So that requirement is proposed to be repealed. And then subdivision 7 is essentially the same with a little addition. So it requires the signatures of the parents or guardians who can make the educational decisions for the students. And then in the update amendment requires in the alternative, the parent seeking enrollment may provide attestation of sole primary educational decision-making authority.
I'll just ask you a quick question. Do you happen to know the background as to why we're getting rid, why this amendment gets rid of the detailed outline or narrative? And this is me going back to section 5. Why get rid of the detail and the the minimum course of study information?
That's a question for the agency. This is all language proposed by the agency. And I was not actually present for any testimony on this last session or when it was in the House. So that would be a question for the administration. So.
You want to jump in on that now?
Sure,
Mine?
yeah. Lindsay Hedges, Agency of Education. My understanding in getting rid of the detailed outline is with the current law, that detailed outline doesn't necessarily provide any assurance that it's being adhered to. So whether they provide it or not, they could be following it, they could be not. It's kind of, it's not, doesn't necessarily provide assurance, but I would encourage you to hear from Emily Simmons. Wrote up the changes.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So subsection B, notice to home study programs. So current law is notice to home study programs. So this is current law contemplates this section to be notice that would be provided from the agency to the home study program. And the amendment in H 461 is it's still notice from AOE to the home study program itself, but it's requiring less information from AOE. So current law requires the secretary or designee to send the home study program written acknowledgement of receipt of that enrollment notice, annual enrollment notice, within 14 days of receiving it. And the documentation includes a determination that the enrollment notice is complete and no further information is needed, or specifically identifying information that's missing. And then what happens if that information is missing? The home study program has 14 days to provide it, and that the child may be enrolled immediately. So then AOE would be telling the home study program, okay, you can enroll your child immediately, or the child will be enrolled 45 days after the enrollment notice is received. And any time before the child may be enrolled, the secretary may order that a hearing be held. And after notice of such a hearing is received, the child shall not be enrolled until after the order has been issued by the hearing officer to that effect. One of the largest changes that H 461 makes to this whole statute is it removes that hearing process altogether. So for the enrollment notice, the acknowledgement of receiving the enrollment notice on the right-hand side here, it requires AOE within 10 days of receiving a complete enrollment notice. The secretary acknowledges it, and then that acknowledgement constitutes sufficient enrollment verification for purposes of section 1121 of this title, which I believe, I didn't make a notation, I believe that's the from here. Yep, that's the mandatory school age attendance statute. So once this acknowledgement is sent out and received, then the student would be considered enrolled in school and not truant. And then you'll see the rest of this language is all repealed. So the only thing required now is that within 10 days of receiving that annual notice that we just walked through, AOE acknowledges it, and then that acknowledgement is sufficient enrollment verification for the compulsory attendance statute. About that. Move on to page 4, subsection C, enrollment reports. So right now, current law on the left-hand side there, each home study program shall notify the secretary within 7 days of the day that any student ceases to be enrolled in the program. And within 10 days of receiving any enrollment report, the secretary shall notify the appropriate superintendent of schools. And now we're retitling this on the right-hand side, withdrawal, striking all of the current language and replacing it with the parent or guardian shall notify the secretary in writing within 10 business days following the date that any student is withdrawn from the student's home study program. So it's adding 3 additional days to the amount of time a parent or guardian has to notify AOE. And it's removing the requirement that the secretary notify the appropriate superintendent of the withdrawal. Subdivision D is, this is the progress assessment section, and you'll see I did a side-by-side right on page 5. But this is what current law requires annually. Progress shall be assessed in each subject area of the minimum course of study by one or more of the following methods. And H461 repeals this section altogether. So what is left, if you look at page 5, so in the annual enrollment notice, part of that enrollment notice, I'm on page 5, it says progress assessments are addressed in subsection A3. This is language we already walked through in that enrollment notice section. So so part of that enrollment notice now has to include an attestation of the academic progress of each child enrolled in a home study will be assessed at the end of each school year, and that the parent or guardian will maintain the record of such assessments. And then we'll walk through the permitted means of such assessment. So it's a little different. Over here on the left-hand column, current law requires progress to be assessed in each subject area of the minimum course of study. And this just says, the H461 amendment is just that home study program will be assessed each year. So it doesn't specifically require assessment in each subject area in the minimum course of study. It's spelled out the same way as current law does. So you can see I tried to line them up. So subdivision B here on the right-hand side is the assessment method is, and one option is a review of the student's progress by an individual who holds a current Vermont teacher certificate. That seemed to line up the most with current law, which is subdivision D1. A report in a form designated by the secretary by a teacher licensed in Vermont, and determining the form of the report, the secretary should consult with parents who have provided home study programs for the children. And nothing in this section shall be construed to require the secretary to consult with parents on an individual basis regarding the form of a teacher report. So teacher report.
Who chooses which educator or teacher will do this investigation?
The assessment,
That's big.
it doesn't spell that out.
Okay. And these amendments that we're making, this is just part of 60 in BSA, right? 166B. Is there more to it?
166B is the entire home study statute, and these are amendments to the entire statute.
Oh, this is the entire
Yes,
statute.
this is it.
So there's nothing in here about curriculum.
No, just the minimum course of study.
Okay, thanks.
Was there something before curriculum?
No, apparently not. I
Okay.
just surprised.
Well, remember, current law requires, I can write to it. If you look at page 2, subdivision 5, in that part of that enrollment notice, current law requires a detailed outline or narrative that describes the content to be provided in each subject area, and that requirement is being repealed.
Hmm.
And I think that's what you all just spoke with Lindsay about.
Figured it would be the other way around. State offer to the parents what the minimum is now. Parents on the state what their intents to teach.
Yeah. Lindsay, you want to say something else about that?
I don't think so. Again, I think Emily Simmons would probably be able to speak to this better than I could, since she had a hand in writing it.
That does seem to be a point worth going back to. Lindsay, would you remind us, a lot of these were corrections that the agency put forward in order to, let's finish, or for more efficiency, for what sorts of,
Yeah, it was intended to streamline the process, and it was also intended to kind of help us mirror what other states in the Northeast are doing. Because as of right now, we are requiring a bit more of families than some of our neighboring states do.
does homeschooling take up is there somebody at the agency that oversees home study?
It is part of their job, but I would have to double check. I don't know if that's someone's sole job.
So is it possible to have that conversation with your colleague about, is there required or recommended curriculum? All we have is a number of days.
Right.
That seems to be the only thing.
Is that different though than, we don't have we have standards, we don't have curriculum. We're still asking them to meet Vermont standards.
Right.
They developed the curriculum, correct? Just like a local school district might, or school or teacher would. So is there anything different here?
Not that I can see.
So maybe that answers the question that the standards drive the curriculum and that they use the same standards. I'm just,
Yeah, no,
I'm not speaking from
That makes sense. I have a thought.
I mean, I would just say that, yes, we are driven by standards, and EQS, but you're ultimately, what's being taught in schools is under the scrutiny of the school board, let's say. And here, I mean, there's no school board that is scrutinizing what's being taught. And that just worries me a little bit, because I have actual personal anecdotes and stories that, which could shed some light on some of this that is troubling.
That's a really good point, that there's no school board that's taking a look into this, and that it's the leading folks in the wild, wild west in terms of the check-in. Okay, can you check in with Ms. Simmons on that, Lindsay?
Yeah.
And email a response to 8, and maybe we'll have Beth, Emily in. Okay.
I just want to clarify, both current law requires that detailed outline. The amendment removed that requirement. But both current law and these amendments just require that the home study program meets the minimum course of study. I don't believe there's any language in either version that ties it specifically to the state standards. So that might,
So it is really a little bit of wild, wild west out there in terms of.
the agency may interpret it differently, and you guys are, the longer we are all here in this room, you're gonna get sick of me hearing. It's part of, I can interpret the black and white language for you, but what the agency does in the field may be different. So I would always encourage you, if you're interested in hearing from the field.
Yeah. So
But-
the other, I just want to note that for Lindsay, if she's taking state standards, it seems to me they should apply. Yeah.
Minimum course of study.
Minimum course of study, I'm sorry.
I just wrote that.
Yeah.
Yep, so minimum course of study actually refers right to it. So, let's see. If you look on page 2 in the highlighted language at the very bottom. So for children younger than 13, they have to have instruction in the subject areas listed in section 906 of this title, which is course of studies. So in public schools, approved and recognized independent schools and home study programs, learning experience shall be provided for students in the minimum course of study, which includes basic communication skills, including reading, writing, and the use of numbers, citizenship, history, and government in Vermont and the United States, physical education and comprehensive health education, including the effects of tobacco, alcoholic drinks, and drugs on the human system and on society, English, American, and other literature, the natural sciences, and the fine arts. And that is it. The state standards are the standards to which all of the curriculum for the public schools need to be developed in order to meet. And then the education quality standards are only applicable to public schools.
So you have a sense of our concern, Lindsay? Okay. We get Emily in tomorrow.
Do you want to keep going?
Please.
Okay, so we're on page 5, so we're talking.
I'm sorry, any other questions? Okay, good. Please go ahead.
So we're on page 5 and we're looking at the types of assessments that may be permitted. So the first one we talked about was a Vermont teacher doing a review of the student's progress. So the second one, which is subdivision 2 in current law and subdivision C in the proposed amendment, is a portfolio, so a parent or guardian portfolio. So current law requires, I'm on the left-hand side here, a report prepared by the students, parents or instructor, or a teacher advisory service report from a publisher of a commercial curriculum, together with a portfolio of the student's work that includes work samples to demonstrate progress in each subject area and the minimum course of study. The proposed amendment just requires a parent or guardian report and portfolio to include a summary of what the student learned during the school year and at least 4 samples of student work. So it's a portfolio, both are portfolio requirements, but what that requirement entails is a little different.
You're looking at Senator Jewett.
I just want to make sure.
Okay.
Okay. So the third option for assessment is on page 6, subdivision 3 in current law, subdivision A in the proposed amendment. So standardized assessments.
Yeah.
And then the proposed amendment also adds 2 new assessment methods. One would be grades from an online academy or school, and there's no similar provision in current law. And then evidence of passing the GED, no similar provision in current law. And then the bulk of the rest of the statute is all repealed. There's a small piece that isn't, but so current law, I'm on the left-hand side on page 6, subsection E. If the secretary has information that creates a significant doubt about whether a home study program can or will provide a minimum course of study, the secretary may call a hearing. That language is repealed.
Just one moment. Where are you exactly?
Page 6.
Yep.
Subdivision E. I'm sorry, subsection E.
Okay. So here's information.
Are we gonna go through all of these together?
Yeah, it'll go real quick from here on out. All repeals.
Okay.
So then subsection F. So that's hearings before enrollment. Subsection F addresses hearings after enrollment if the secretary has information that reasonably could be expected to justify an order of termination under this section. They can call for a hearing, and that section is all the proposal is to repeal that.
Please.
Wait, why would we want to get rid of that?
Lindsay, do you want to jump in?
I'm gonna defer to Emily on
Okay,
this.
we'll have Emily in
I don't-
tomorrow to take us through.
I'm sorry.
Okay, no, that's fair.
Subsection G is the notice and procedure for those hearing requirements. The amendment in H 461 that proposes to repeal that language. Same for subsection H, which is the order that would follow a hearing. The proposal is to repeal that language. I'm on page 8 now. Subsection I is the minimum course of study language. The current law, this is where the minimum course of study language lives. The proposed amendment is proposing to, on the right-hand side, repeal this entire subsection. But the requirements of the minimum course of study now live in subsection A, which is that, and what the information that needs to be included in the enrollment notice that we
So
walked
this
through.
isn't gone together. This is
It's not gone.
okay.
It's a little, so it still requires an attestation that the child, well, so let's see. So the side-by-side appears towards the bottom of the page, minimum course of study. So current law says it has to be provided every school year. And the educational content is adapted in each area of study to the age and ability of each child and to any disability of the child. Nothing in this section requires that a home study program follow the program or methods used by public schools. If you go over to the right-hand column, attestation that's now required as part of the enrollment notice has to attest that the child will be provided the equivalent of at least 175 days of instruction in the minimum course of study. So the current law requires it will be provided every school year. And then this is saying, which is by law, 107, it has to be 175 instructional days. And the amendment is saying that children, there's requiring an attestation that children enrolled in a home study program are being provided at least 175 days of instruction in the minimum course of study. So that term school year is removed. But what that looks like for different age groups is the same. So for a child who is younger than 13 years of age, the subject area is listed in section 906 of this title, which is what we just walked through in the minimum course of study section. And then I'm on page 9 now. For a child who is 13 years of age or older, it's the same requirements. So only basic communication skills, including reading, writing, and the use of numbers, citizenship, history, and government in Vermont, the United States, English, American, and other literature, and then natural sciences. And then for students with documented disabilities, the parent or guardian must attest to providing adaptations to support the student in the home study program. That's the language from the amendment. You'll see that language in current law. We go back to page 8. Requires subsection I there. Educational content provided shall be adapted to each area and the ability of each child and to any disability of the child. So that's similar language there. Subsection J is with adding a little section title there for subsection title for waiver. And it's largely the same as current law. So after the filing of an enrollment notice, if the home study program is unable to comply with any of the specific requirements due to a deep religious conviction shared by an organized group, the secretary may waive such requirements. That's current law. And there's the only real substantive change is the removal of the reference to hearing.
Quick
Yeah,
question.
please.
What is the definition of a deep religious conviction compared to a not deep religious conviction?
It is not defined in this section. And then subsection K is what has to happen annually. So current law says that I'm on page 9. If a student has successfully completed 2 consecutive school years, and those 2 years fall within the most recent 5 years, they don't have to submit a detailed outline or narrative describing the content of the minimum course of study each year after that. And that language is all struck. And what's required now on page 9, the right-hand side, subsection K, is an annual notice. So a parent or guardian who has provided a complete enrollment notice in subsection A, has to notify AOE on or before the start of each following year of the parent or guardian's intention to continue to provide that instruction through a home study program. And the notice shall be provided at least 10 business days prior to the intended start date of the home study program. And then subsection L is, the amendment, it proposes to repeal this language altogether. So current law requires, basically says that they have to comply with all the other sections of this section, after those completing the 2 consecutive years. The only thing you don't have to do is, let's see. A home study program has successfully completed 2 consecutive school years of home study segments defined in subsection K shall not be exempt from any other requirements of the section. And shall annually submit a description of special services and adaptations to accommodate any disability of the child. And that's, the proposal there is to repeal that. And that is the entire section on the home study program. That is it.
House make a lot of changes based on what they were given,
They did not make any changes.
so they just said, okay, this looks good to us. I mean, not minimizing anything, they went through and reviewed
I believe this language is as introduced.
as introduced by the Agency of Education. Or these were their requests.
Yes.
Okay, so we have a few questions, and we'll have Emily Simmons in tomorrow for a little while to get those questions answered. This is really helpful. I mean, bottom line, we just want to make sure that kids are getting educated, no matter, a home study program or in schools. Okay. Ms. St. James, can you watch or join us for Boreac?
Yes, I was planning to just go back to my office, but I'm
Great.
happy,
No.
I'm happy to stick around if you want me to.
Whatever works for you.
Okay. I would.
Committee, let's take 10 minutes. We'll come back.